Hi, Gareth.
Hi, Alex. How are you doing?
Excellent. Good morning in my part of the world, and thank you
Yes,
for spending the
and
late evening in your part of the world.
no, that's a pleasure, Alex. I always appreciate getting your views on things. So listen, thanks for making the time to talk to me today in a little 10-minute clip or so about quantitative risk analysis. And I know this is something you do quite a lot of, and I know this is something that you're passionate about. And I wondered whether you could just talk to me about what you see as the keys to doing it well.
And thank you. I do want to kind of to structure my answer in two groups. And as usual, there's the Pareto principle where one part of the kind of quantitative risk analysis should be done when necessary, very little of, and then they so your 20%, maybe even less than that, and then the 80% should be spent on something else. So first, I'll talk about the kind of the obvious one, which is what, thank God, most institutes are now promoting, and most groups are now promoting, is using quantitative risk analysis to better understand risks. Now, what I want our listeners to consider, or at least give it an extra thought, is that doing risk analysis for the sake of better understanding a specific type of risk, be it cyber, be it foreign exchange, be it sanctions, be it something else, competition, using quantitative risk analysis to understand better the nature of a particular risk is very powerful, very important, not difficult at all, because we've for 50 or 60 or 70 years we've had the tools to do it. The software to do it is now free, so there's absolutely no reason not to do it. Most computers now have sufficient power to allow us to perform quantitative risk analysis. So there's really no reason not to do it. And the only kind of word of warning that I want to give our listeners to is quantifying risk for the sake of understanding a specific risk exposure is a very, very small part of the journey, of the overall journey. It's literally the tip of the iceberg. So understanding foreign exchange risk exposure, or understanding cyber risk exposure, or understanding the exposure from sanctions, or from a new technology or new legislation for that matter, is a very, very tiny piece of our effort when it comes to your big umbrella of quantitative risk analysis. And that's very
Mm-hmm.
important. Kind of the first word of warning, it's the tip of the iceberg at best. It's actually quite rare when we would be required to explicitly analyze a specific risk to understand what its kind of consolidated exposure is for the organization. And it has a very small um, business value beyond just kind of information awareness, and it sells really well to the executives and the board because it looks nice. But then there's a much better way, the other 80%, which is what I want to talk about, talk about
Okay.
more. And just the last thing, the second word of warning on the first, the tip of the iceberg, the quantifying risks for the sake of quantifying risks, is that risk is not a number. It's not a single number. I mean, to most of us who have been using quantitative risk analysis, it's kind of obvious. And there's no such thing as risk and opportunity, because those things are not separate. Uh, Analyzing risk is always a range. And that range has negative scenarios, has positive scenarios. Using proper quantitative risk analysis kind of guarantees that you see a much broader picture. You stop thinking about risk as a single value. You think about risk as actually a distribution of possible outcomes on the objective or decision or whatever else it may be. And you see both opportunities and risks in the same diagram, and that diagram is usually the distribution, or the even the tornado diagram shows you kind of the both sides of the story. So that's very useful. But I wanted to spend the remaining 5 minutes on the much bigger, much more important, and just like an iceberg. I mean, I just came up with that, and I know the reference to
Nice
icebergs are not,
analogy. I'm listening.
it's not new in any way, but this is so true because everybody talks about the tip. Like quantitative risk analysis is now a given that we should, and what's the sexiest risk of this year? It's cyber. So thank God, I'm so grateful. Organizations are actually using proper mathematical methods to analyze cyber risk. But next year it will be something different. But the kind of the big, this underwater piece, which is missing from everybody's attention, which I wanted to talk about. This is so much more important. And in the second bucket of quantifying risk, it's actually not quantifying risk for the sake of understanding, for the sake of better understanding risk. It's using risk analysis as a subset or a step or a side product of your normal business processes. So when the company develops a strategy for the next 5 years, along the way, it will have made a number of assumptions. Well, those assumptions need to be validated. They need to be tested. The strategy needs to be calculated not just once using a single assumption for every single entry, every single factor, but using a range of possible outcomes because life is uncertain. So the strategy is actually not a single strategy. It's at least 3 or 5 different scenarios, or at most, thousands of different simulations using Monte Carlo to validate all those different assumptions, to see how realistic they are, and come up with the range of possible strategies. So this is what the kind of the underwater piece. Risk management is less about doing something for the sake of risks. Risk management is something about making better business decisions or business processes. So your strategy looks different. Your strategy
and if I
looks
can
now.
say, Alex, I think what you're saying is that it's stitched into what a business, what an organization does. It's just inherent to what they do.
Well, absolutely. And this, I mean, what you've just said actually has so many implications, because that means you can't do risk analysis on a quarterly basis. I mean, that's useless. You have to do risk analysis at the same time, in the same room as the CFO, CEO, CEO, when they come up with the assumptions, when they put together the strategy. So when you have the strategic meeting and everybody kind of, brainstorms those assumptions, and then the head of strategy or the CFO goes out and then calculates everything and brings it back the numbers, well, you should be in that room with the head of strategy and the CFO doing the calculations together, and then together coming back with a range of possible strategic outcomes.
And as you're talking there, Alex, you also make me think about there's that business aspect. There are elements to the business, such as projects they're undertaking, for example. The governance is exactly the same. The point being that you're doing it as you're developing the project and the project plans, not doing it afterwards or as an afterthought.
And that's exactly the point. I mean, I've just mentioned how we can use risk analysis to provide a range of financial values, saying, and this is how we've actually, I mean, this is how we've calculated KPIs, strategic KPIs. It wasn't a single number, it was always a range. And that, I mean, that has so many positive implications. The executives can actually choose which percentile they will use. It will give them a lot of flexibility. I mean, there are numerous benefits to proper risk analysis, not just that you start challenging the decision makers and start seeing that most, some things are just unrealistic. I mean, I keep saying the same example, and sorry, I'll have to come up with some new examples, I guess, in the future. But the first iteration of the strategy, like 2020 strategy that I was doing risk analysis on many years ago, had 99.9% chance of default. So that first iteration of the strategy it was presented back. Every single executive went like, okay, well, that's not going to work. We're not going to take it to the government. And so we ended up taking like version 15, which was with many, many iterations. At every single instance, risk was recalculating the range of potential outcomes. So it was.
So the key here for people, if I could, if you could summarize that just to wrap up the point here, then Alex, you talked about the iceberg. Nice analogy. I like it. I think I might steal that. So what's on top. Yes, there's elements there, but there's this big element below. So if we could close off, what would be your key message for people watching and listening to this?
Be aware of what's happening in the quantitative risk space. There are more and more tools becoming available to us for free. There's a lot of literature that is dating back 10, 20, 30 years, which is still valid and very valuable in terms of understanding how to do risk analysis. And keep in mind that quantifying risk for the sake of understanding risk better, a specific risk better, or a specific group of risks better, is nice, but it's nowhere close to the business value that you can generate by using risk analysis inside the business process. Doing the different budget, doing the different strategic plan, doing the different project schedule, because you cannot not just add quantification to the money, you can also add quantification to the deadlines. And you can say, no, this project will not be completed in 6 months as you're promising. In fact, it will be completed between 9 and 12 months, unless you do something about it. And this is this is how the conversation goes. So in terms of this iceberg analogy, quantifying risks for the sake of risk is great, but a very small subset of the overall journey and overall value as well, because the real business value is changing how budgets, strategies, project plan, investment proposals, operational forecasts, set pricing, sales forecasts, how all of those things, because all of them are uncertain and volatile, how all of those things can be improved using risk analysis. So the risk manager becomes not the kind of the driver and the producer of the risk report. He becomes a tool that the head of sales calls and goes, I need to create the forecast for my team and I need to set realistic KPIs. In certain regions, risks are high. Can you help me use risk analysis tools to provide the better sales targets for all my all my team members? That's the kind
I think that's a really good analogy there to finish off with, Alex.
Thank you, Gareth.
Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.